Welcome back to Butler on Business. On the phone with us now is Mr. Keith Hall.
And from 2008 until 2012, he served as the 13th Commissioner of the Bureau of Labor Statistics.
Keith, welcome to the show, guy.
Good to be with you.
It's an honor to have you. Now, why the great disparity between the U3, the U6, and then the participation rate?
The big reason for the disparity really is they're trying to broaden the measure. Let me just say about U3 in particular. That definition of unemployment, if you think about it, what it's trying to do is that you're trying to get a measure of the number of people who don't have jobs but who are part of the labor supply. Right, and that's really what the labor force is a way to try to measure the labor supply. But U3, to be honest, is a pretty narrow measure, and it's got its problems. I'd say right now it's probably the most misleading piece of economic data that we have right now is the U3, because that definition of labor force is so narrow, because people have to actively be looking, that I think it's giving you a false sense of improvement some months when really the labor market really hasn't improved. All of that improvement in the unemployment rate, in fact, maybe a little bit more than 100% of that improvement, was because of the labor force declining, not from an increase in employment. And so what we've had over that particular time period, we've had, in my opinion, the biggest disengagement from the labor force that we've ever had.
So when you say the labor force is declining, is that actually people are themselves dropping out of the labor force, or are we talking about people are no longer being counted by the BLS, or maybe a little bit of both?
Yeah, it's more that they're not being counted. What happens, of course, for some folks is they're unemployed, and if they're unemployed for long enough, at some point they sort of no longer continue to look. Although they may be ready and they want to find a job, so oftentimes I think they'll just sort of drop out of the labor force, and by that I mean they stop actively looking, but they'll jump back in once the economy starts to improve and they think there's some chance that they'll get work. So I think in large part this is a real problem with using the unemployment rate as your only measure of labor market progress. Sometimes it just doesn't do a good job, and it's not doing a good job right now.
Keith, if you were going to design the perfect system to tally or to report on an unemployment, what would that look like?
Well, I think the first thing that needs to be done is people need to look at the data more intelligently, because a lot of this information is there. You know, if you want to do a little calculation, this is not something that BLS would do, but if you want to do a little calculation, sort of think about it this way, the labor force participation has really dropped tremendously. What if it hadn't dropped? What if it stayed up at about the same percentage of the population as it was, say, before the recession? So, you know, I would say people, from what most people think about when they think about the unemployment rate, they think, gee, how many people are working now versus the number of people who would normally be working? To be honest, I've spent a lot of time with the BLS data. I really don't think the problem with BLS data is that the data itself is incorrect or the definitions are incorrect. I think, as I mentioned before, I think the real issue is that the data is interpreted properly. I believe people are looking at the right things to get an understanding of the labor market. One of the big problems is you can't just look at one number or two numbers. You need to sort of look at the whole thing and get sort of a reasonable description of what's going on, I think.
So, Keith, if you had to put your thumb on it, who is not interpreting this data properly? Is it the media, the politicians, folks within the BLS, just the general population? Who are we talking about here?
Well, I think obviously the media, and I think to a large degree it's economists, to be honest, who are on the media, who just sort of quote the unemployment rate, and who really should know better that they need to dig in and look at other things besides the unemployment rate to get a real picture of the economy. I get distressed about that a bit, especially when I was the commissioner of the Bureau of Labor Statistics. When I would hear folks sort of misuse the data, we would make an effort to sort of explain it if they didn't seem to understand it. But lots of times it seems to be it could be intentional.
I also wonder if the politicians don't intentionally misuse the data.
Yeah, that's a concern. One of the things that I think is really valuable is when I was commissioner, and always now commissioners, pretty much, whoever's commissioner, testifies once a month when the jobs data comes out, testifies before the Joint Economic Committee. And the real value of that is you're hearing from the agency head who's got an objective view on things, who doesn't have a political agenda, who's talking about his or her interpretation of the data and answering direct questions about what the data means. I think that's extremely valuable. I kind of wish the press paid closer attention to that testimony every month.
I had started off asking you how you would go about doing it, because it's very frustrating for me. They'll sit around almost like this is the financial media. They'll sit around every month waiting for the release, like they're getting ready to prognosticate on the Super Bowl. The headline number is released. Everybody runs with a headline number. We get the report. We dig into the headline number, and what they're talking about and what took place generally are two different things.
Yeah, I do get concerned about that, and obviously that's one of the reasons why I'm talking with you and I'm doing this sort of thing. I do think it's really important to have some objective talk about the data and be able to offer some real understanding about what's going on with the labor market.
Well, let's do that then. What's really going on?
Well, I think the thing that's been missed is the labor market hit bottom, and I think because the unemployment rate's been going down, people think the economy's improved. I don't think the labor market has improved at all. We've been flat out just treading water. And the one piece of data that I would point to, and in fact I've been doing this in my testimony since the labor force started to drop, is if you look at something really simple, look at the employment to population ratio. It's the simplest thing in the world. You don't worry about whether somebody's actively looking or not looking. Just sort of say, how many people out of the population have a job? And that's a low level. And that number has not budged. And until you have the employment, the share of people in the population who have a job, until you have that number start to go up significantly, you're not really having a recovery. And we don't have a recovery yet.
Well, Keith, how does that low number right now compare to other recessions that we've seen in the past?
It is way lower than others. It's dropped by more than other recessions. I think it's a real indication this is a more severe recession than we've had in many decades.
Keith, why not let that be the headline number then, as opposed to this U3 number?
I would be perfectly happy for that to be the headline number. I've been pointing. I can tell you in my testimony since at least 2009, maybe 2010, I've been pointing out that that's the one number you should be looking at right now if you want to see if the jobs report is showing an improvement or not.
So you like the total percentage better than even the participation rate?
I do, and especially right now when the participation rate has moved around so much, and that so depends upon the precise definition that BLS uses. If you go to something simple, lots of time, it's one of those rules of life. Sometimes you can just go to something really simple and get the best picture of it. Sometimes the media is not doing people a service by focusing on the wrong things out of the jobs report.
Keith, would it be fair to call the U3 almost a political number?
Yeah, I hesitate to call it a political number because that gets to the motivation for using it. I think it's fair to say right now it is not a very useful number. It doesn't really tell you anything about the labor market. It's political, I suppose, in the sense that every time we have a recession, it really does underestimate the impact on the labor market. It sort of underestimates how bad the labor market is, and I think it's never been more evident than right now. It really is not a very good indicator.
It's my understanding during the Clinton years, they defined away 5 million people from the U6. Is that correct? Is that statement correct?
Well, that's right. At the end of the 90s, they did redefine some of those U's a little bit, and they were trying to get some idea of what underemployment is like. And that's a reasonable thing to try to get to. I don't think they were terribly successful, however. And the reason that it's a concern is the unemployment rate counts you employed if you have just 1 hour of work. It's employed. It's the same as if you have one hour a month or if you have 40 hours a month. So it doesn't really do a good job of telling you how underemployed people are, and that's one of the weaknesses, again, of the unemployment rate.
The U3 as defined is an accurate number. The U6 as defined is an accurate number. However, they're not the more telling number.
That's correct.
Okay. I'm getting better at this. Now, you have really helped me out. Now, why the disparity between, say, the participation rate and the U6?
Well, the U6 tries to add in things like discouraged workers who are not counted as part of the labor force, but they're people who say they want a job. And part of the reason why that doesn't do a really good job of it is because a lot of people say they really want a job, even in the best of times, and they don't actually go out and get one. They say they want a job, but they actually don't really go out and look for one. That's one of the reasons why the U6 doesn't wind up being that helpful, I think.
Is the participation rate a helpful number?
It's helpful. It's helpful, and in fact, even if you didn't have the population ratio that we've talked about, even if you had just that combined with the unemployment rate kind of tells you what you need to know. You know, if the labor force's participation is going down and your unemployment rate's going up, that's an indication that the wrong thing is causing the unemployment rate to go up. It's people quitting, and it's not people getting jobs.
Now, the employment rate, that is the number of employed people. Are we counting people more than once if they have multiple jobs, or only once?
Only once.
Okay, so that is relative to the entire population of the United States, both in and outside of the labor force?
That's right. That's right, and that's why I like it as a measure, because you aren't making any sort of judgment about who should be counted or not in the labor force. It's simply, in fact, it's the simplest measure possible, and I think right now it's probably the best measure.
And what are the qualifications, Keith, for including somebody in that participation rate?
Well, you have to either have a job, or if you don't have a job, you have to be actively looking, which means they literally call you on the phone and say, so what did you do over the past month to get a job? And if you didn't go knock on a door or send out a resume, you're not counted as unemployed. They just consider you to be out of the labor force entirely.
Why do the media and the politicians then they're infatuated with a very narrow definition as represented by the U3?
I don't know. I think it's at least laziness, because there are lots of numbers there that give you a fuller picture. But this is maybe where it gets a little political. You know, whatever administration's in, when the unemployment rate starts to go up, the last thing they're going to do is tell you it's not going up as much as it should.
How do they go about changing the definitions?
Yeah, that is a definition that the BLS uses, and interestingly, that is sort of the international definition of unemployment. It's sort of an agreement between countries, and that's how they're going to define unemployment. I think that the real problem ultimately is it's a trade-off between getting something you can measure accurately and getting something that's useful. And the unemployment rate, when they made that definition, they erred on the side of something that's going to be easy to measure. Because all they have to do is ask you, what did you do to get a job? And based on your answer, they know exactly how to treat you. When people really, when they think about the unemployment rate, they want to know who's normally in the labor force, who would be working under better times. And that's a harder thing to measure, and I think that's a big part of why they don't try to measure it, and I think it's a little disappointing that they don't.
The U3, then, we're looking 6 months or less, unemployed 6 months or less, having actively looked for a job in the last 4 weeks.
That's right.
Now, the U6, and the U6 is a year or less unemployed, having actively looked in the last 4 weeks?
It's that, plus it's also people who are part-time who want to be full-time. So it does have an element of underemployment in there.
Keith, when they roll out of the U6, what happens to them? Well,
they kind of aren't counted. They just kind of aren't counted. They aren't in anywhere. As they use the terminology at BLS, they're jobless but not unemployed, which is an important distinction for a statistician. It's just not important for the rest of us.
And the reason we have the U3 and U6 defined as the way they are is that basically the G20 or G7 governments all got together and said we will, as a common denominator, measure our unemployment rates this way.
Well, that's actually true, yes. Yes,
you taught me that.
Yes. It is part of an international standard, and I tell you the real challenge is knowing who would normally have a job at this point in time. We know people that they don't have a job, but we don't know if under better times they would have a job. And what they've done is they've decided the best way to try to measure that, and as we've seen, it's inadequate, is you would normally be employed if you are now currently looking. If you quit, then they presume that you wouldn't even be employed during good times, and that's obviously not true.
This is Keith Hall, ladies and gentlemen. For 5 years, he ran the Bureau of Labor Statistics. Keith, I am so appreciative of you calling us each month with these numbers.